As I stand before you today, I cannot help but feel the weight of history which surrounds us and which reminds us of the vital parliamentary traditions to which members of both houses dedicate yourselves with such personal commitment for the betterment of us all.
The palace just confirmed what we all feared, and it's absolutely devastating. Royal insiders are calling this the darkest moment in modern monarchy history. What happened behind those gates is so shocking, even seasoned staff members broke down in tears.
Parliament is the living and breathing instrument of our democracy. That your traditions are ancient, we see in the construction of this great hall.
King Charles made a decision that stunned the entire world. By mid-morning, an unusual tension had settled over the historic building. Staff members who normally exchanged friendly greetings in the corridors now moved past each other with tight smiles and worried glances. The atmosphere felt heavy, as if everyone knew something significant was happening, but nobody was quite sure what it was. Senior advisors were seen moving quickly between offices, their expressions serious and focused. Meetings that had been scheduled for weeks suddenly disappeared from calendars without explanation. Phone calls were being made behind closed doors, and the normal rhythm of palace life had been disrupted in a way that even the longest-serving employees couldn't remember experiencing before. Outside the palace gates, journalists who had been stationed there for years began to notice unusual activity. Security vehicles that weren't part of the regular schedule started arriving at side entrances. Staff members were using doors that were rarely opened, avoiding the main entrances where they might be seen. The changing of the guard ceremony went ahead as planned, but even the guards seemed to carry themselves differently, as if they too were aware that something serious was unfolding behind the scenes. Social media began to buzz with speculation. Royal correspondents who had spent their careers building sources and contacts within palace circles started posting cryptic messages about significant developments. Nobody had concrete information yet, but the signs were impossible to ignore. Something major was happening, and the palace's usual carefully managed communication strategy seemed to have been abandoned in favor of complete silence. Then, just after midday, the royal family's official website went offline without warning. For several minutes, visitors to the site were met with error messages. When the site came back online, everything had changed. There on the homepage was a statement that would soon be read by millions of people around the world. The royal crest sat at the top of the page, and below it, a brief announcement written in plain black text against a white background. The statement was short, but every word carried enormous weight. It confirmed that something deeply distressing had occurred within the royal family. The language was careful, but couldn't hide the gravity of the situation. There were no details about what had happened, no explanations or clarifications. Instead, the statement simply acknowledged that a tragedy had taken place and asked for privacy as the family dealt with this unimaginable situation. It thanked the public for their understanding and support during what was described as an incredibly difficult time. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, news channels across Britain interrupted their regular programming to share the statement. Presenters read the words aloud, their voices betraying their own shock at what they were reporting. In homes, offices, schools, and shops across the country, people stopped what they were doing to process what they had just heard. The announcement was shared thousands of times on social media, with people expressing disbelief and concern in equal measure. At Buckingham Palace, crowds began to gather. At first, it was just a handful of people, drawn by the news and wanting to be near the place where history was unfolding. But within hours, that handful had grown into hundreds, and then thousands. People arrived carrying flowers, many of them still wrapped in paper from nearby shops. Some brought photographs of the royal family from happier times. Others came empty-handed, simply wanting to be part of the collective moment of shock and grief that was sweeping through London. The atmosphere outside the palace was unlike anything that had been seen in years. There was no noise, no chanting, no sense of spectacle. Instead, a profound silence settled over the crowd. People stood shoulder to shoulder, strangers united by the news they had just received. Some were crying openly. Others stood in stunned silence, staring up at the palace windows, as if hoping to catch a glimpse of what was happening inside. Police officers moved through the crowd carefully, ensuring that people could lay their flowers and tributes safely while maintaining order in what was quickly becoming an enormous gathering. Television crews from around the world set up their equipment along the palace perimeter. Reporters spoke in hushed, respectful tones as they broadcast live updates to their audiences. The story was front-page news everywhere from New York to Sydney, from Paris to Tokyo. The British royal family had always captured global attention, but this was different. This wasn't about ceremony or celebration. This was about human tragedy, and people everywhere could relate to that on a fundamental level. Inside the palace, sources later described an atmosphere of profound sadness. The building that was usually full of activity and purpose had fallen into an eerie quiet. Staff members who had worked there for decades said they had never experienced anything like it. Some were sent home early and told to await further instructions. Others were asked to remain at their posts but found themselves with little to do except wait. The corridors that were normally filled with the sounds of footsteps and conversations now echoed with silence. As evening approached, the crowd outside continued to grow. The pavement near the gates became covered with flowers, creating a sea of colour against the grey London stone. Candles were lit as darkness fell, their small flames flickering in the cold. Wind. Handwritten notes and cards were placed among the flowers, messages of support and sympathy from ordinary people who felt compelled to express their feelings in some tangible way. Church bells across London began to toll, their deep, solemn sounds carrying across the city. It wasn't an official directive, but rather a spontaneous response from various parishes who felt moved to mark the moment in this traditional way. The sound of the bells added to the sense that something historic and deeply significant was taking place. The palace itself remained largely dark and silent. A few lights could be seen in some windows, but there was no movement, no signs of life beyond those faint glows. The building that had stood as a symbol of continuity and stability for generations now seemed fragile and vulnerable. The tragedy that had struck the royal family had, in that moment, transformed the palace from a monument of power into a house of mourning. Behind the imposing walls of Buckingham Palace, away from the cameras and the growing crowds, the royal family was experiencing something that no amount of training or preparation could have readied them for. Those who were present during those first hours described an atmosphere so heavy with grief that it seemed to permeate every corner of the historic building. The corridors that had witnessed centuries of royal history now bore witness to raw human emotion in its most unfiltered form. Senior members of the household staff, many of whom had served the family for decades, moved through their duties with visible distress. Some were seen wiping away tears in quiet corners, trying to maintain their composure while dealing with their own shock at what had occurred. The palace, which operated like a well-oiled machine under normal circumstances, seemed to have lost its usual precision. Tasks were forgotten, schedules abandoned, and the rigid protocols that governed daily life were set aside in the face of overwhelming grief. The early afternoon, an emergency meeting was convened in one of the palace's private chambers. Senior members of the royal family gathered around a long table, their faces pale and drawn. The room, normally used for state business and official discussions, now served as a space for the family to come together and try to make sense of what had happened. Advisors presented options and outlined potential courses of action, but their words seemed to fall flat in the room. This wasn't a problem that could be solved with careful planning or strategic thinking. This was personal loss, and no amount of expertise could ease that kind of pain. King Charles sat at the head of the table, a position he had occupied for a relatively short time. Those present later described him as appearing almost frozen, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the walls of the room. He had spent his entire life preparing to lead, to represent the nation with dignity and strength. But on this day, all of that, preparation seemed inadequate. He was not just a monarch dealing with a crisis of state. He was a father confronting a loss that struck at the very heart of his family. Throughout much of the meeting, he remained silent, occasionally nodding at what was being said, but offering few words of his own. Queen Camilla sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm in a quiet gesture of support. She had long been a steadying presence in his life, and on this day, that role took on even greater significance. The meeting eventually concluded, but nobody seemed quite ready to leave. Staff members and family alike remained in the room, united in their shock and unsure of what to do next. When people finally began to disperse, they moved slowly, as if the weight of what had happened made even simple movements difficult. Elsewhere in the palace, Prince William was struggling with his own grief. He had grown up within these walls, learning from an early age what it meant to be part of the royal family. He understood duty and responsibility in ways that most people never would, but he also understood loss. Years earlier, he had walked behind his mother's coffin while the world watched, a young boy forced to grieve in public. Now, as a man and a father himself, he was facing another profound loss, and the weight of it was almost unbearable. Those close to William said that in the weeks leading up to this day, he had seemed increasingly strained. His public appearances had become less frequent, and when he did appear, there was a tiredness in his eyes that makeup and careful lighting couldn't quite hide. He had continued to fulfill his duties, shaking hands and making speeches, but those who knew him well could see that something was wrong. The pressure of being second in line to the throne, of raising 3 children in the public eye, of constantly balancing personal needs with public expectations, had been building for a long time. This tragedy brought all of that pressure to a devastating breaking point. William spent much of that afternoon alone in his private study, away from advisors and staff. His phone rang constantly with calls from dignitaries, family members, and friends. But for hours he answered none of them. He sat in silence, looking out over gardens where his children often played, trying to process a reality that had arrived with shocking suddenness. The man who would one day be king had always carried himself with careful control, presenting a calm and capable image to the world. But on this day, that carefully maintained exterior crumbled. Princess Catherine, known to most as Kate, remained a steady presence throughout the ordeal. She had married into the royal family knowing that her life would never be entirely private again. But nothing could have prepared her for this moment. Those who saw her during those first hours described her as focused and composed, not in a cold or distant way, but with the quiet strength of someone determined to hold her family together. She moved between caring for her children and supporting William, trying to create some sense of normalcy in a situation that was anything but normal. When William and Kate finally appeared before cameras later that day, the transformation from their usual public personas was striking. There were no practiced smiles, no carefully rehearsed statements. William's eyes were visibly red, his face pale and drawn. He stood at a microphone with Kate beside him, her hand occasionally touching his arm in a gesture of support that was both intimate and telling. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion, each word seeming to require immense effort. He thanked the public for their kindness and asked for understanding as the family tried to navigate this incredibly difficult time. He requested privacy not in the formal tone of a royal statement, but with the genuine plea of a husband and father trying to protect the people he loved most. The brief appearance lasted only a few minutes, but it was enough to show the world that the polished image of royal life had been stripped away, leaving only raw human grief in its place. After the cameras were turned off, William and Kate returned to their home at Windsor, away from the palace and the crowds. A short statement was released, announcing that they would be stepping back from public duties temporarily. Behind closed doors, they focused on their children, trying to maintain routines and provide the stability that young people need, especially during times of crisis. William read bedtime stories and helped with homework, ordinary acts of fatherhood that took on extraordinary significance as he tried to shield his family from the storm raging beyond their walls. Throughout the evening, staff at the palace continued their work in a kind of daze. Meals were prepared but largely went uneaten. The usual evening routines were carried out mechanically, everyone going through the motions while their minds remained fixed on the tragedy that had unfolded. The ticking of ancient clocks seemed louder than usual in the quiet halls, each second marking time in a day that would be remembered for generations. As night fell over London, King Charles remained largely in seclusion. He declined briefings and turned away most visitors, needing time alone to process his grief. The palace that had stood for centuries as a symbol of royal power and continuity had become something far more humble and human. It was simply a house where a family was mourning, where titles and crowns offered no protection from the universal experience of loss. The tragedy had revealed what had always been true, but was rarely acknowledged so openly. Beneath the ceremony and tradition, the royal family were people who could hurt and grieve just like anyone else. In the days following the initial announcement, King Charles faced a decision that would define his early reign. He was caught between two fundamental aspects of his identity: his role as monarch and his reality as a grieving father. The nation was looking to him for guidance and reassurance during this unprecedented moment. But how could he provide comfort to millions when his own heart was breaking? His advisors understood the delicate position he was in and worked carefully to help him navigate it. But ultimately, the decision about how to address the country had to be his alone. Behind closed doors, multiple drafts of a potential speech were written and discarded. Each version felt too formal, too distant, too much like the kind of statement that royal protocol demanded but human emotion rejected. King Charles sat at his desk, crossing out lines that had been carefully crafted by speechwriters, replacing them with his own words. He knew that this moment required something different from the traditional royal address. The people needed to hear not from a king reading from a script, but from a person speaking from the heart. The palace. Communications team worked around the clock to prepare for the broadcast. Every detail was considered, from the lighting in the room to the camera angles that would be used. But even as they made these technical preparations, there was an understanding that no amount of professional polish could mask or should mask the genuine emotion of the moment. This wasn't about presenting a perfect image, it was about showing the truth of what the family was experiencing. When the evening of the broadcast arrived, cameras were set up in one of the palace's historic rooms. The space was lined with portraits of previous monarchs, a visual reminder of the long history King Charles was now part of. He sat at a wooden desk, dressed in black, his hands folded in front of him. Those present in the room described the atmosphere as almost unbearably tense. Everyone understood that what was about to happen would be watched by millions and remembered for years to come. As the recording began, King Charles lifted his head and looked directly into the camera. His voice, when he started to speak, was softer than usual, lacking the practiced projection that normally characterized his public addresses. There was a vulnerability in his tone that was striking precisely because it was so rare. He spoke about the tragedy that had befallen his family, acknowledging the pain without going into specific details. He thanked the nation for the outpouring of support and compassion that had been shown in the days since the news broke. Then he said something that resonated far beyond the immediate context of the broadcast. He spoke about how, regardless of titles or positions, everyone is fundamentally human. He acknowledged that even those who wear crowns experience grief and loss in the same way as anyone else. It was a simple observation, but coming from the King of England, it carried profound weight. For generations, the monarchy had maintained a certain distance from the public, presenting an image of strength and continuity that sometimes felt more symbolic than real. At that moment, King Charles closed that distance. The broadcast lasted only a few minutes, but its impact was immediate and far-reaching. In homes across Britain, families gathered around televisions and watched in silence. The King's words weren't elaborate or particularly poetic, but they were genuine, and that authenticity cut through the usual barriers between the monarchy and the people. Social media filled with responses from people who had been moved by what they had heard. Even those who had been skeptical of the royal family or indifferent to its affairs found themselves affected by the raw honesty of the address. Outside Buckingham Palace, the crowd that had been maintaining a constant vigil grew even larger after the broadcast. People felt a renewed connection to the family inside those walls, a sense that they were all part of a shared experience of grief. Candles continued to burn, flowers continued to accumulate, and the quiet solidarity of strangers standing together in the cold became one of the defining images of those difficult days. As more time passed, questions began to emerge about what had actually happened. The initial statement had been deliberately vague, speaking only of a distressing development without providing details. This lack of information had led to speculation and rumour, some of it wild and unfounded. The palace eventually released additional information, though still carefully worded and respectful of the family's privacy. What emerged was a picture not of scandal or controversy, but of deeply personal loss. According to sources close to the family, the tragedy was related to health issues that had been developing privately for some time. While the exact nature of the situation was not fully disclosed, it became clear that this was about personal suffering rather than public drama. The family had been dealing with difficulties that most people could relate to on some level: concerns about loved ones, the feeling of helplessness in the face of circumstances beyond one's control, and the gradual realization that some situations cannot be fixed, no matter how much power or resources one might have. Prince William's visible distress made more sense in this context. Those who knew him spoke about how the pressures of royal life had been accumulating for years. Every public appearance required careful planning and flawless execution. Every word spoken in public could be analysed and criticised. His children were growing up under constant scrutiny, their every milestone documented and discussed by strangers. The weight of being second in line to the throne meant living with the knowledge that his life was not entirely his own, that duty would always compete with personal desires and needs. The tragedy had brought all of these pressures to a head. When William appeared before cameras with Kate by his side, what the world saw was a man who had reached his breaking point. The careful control he had maintained for so long had given way to raw emotion. His request for privacy wasn't a formal royal decree, but a heartfelt plea from someone trying to protect his family during an impossibly difficult time. The public response to his vulnerability was overwhelmingly sympathetic. People understood that what they were witnessing was not weakness, but humanity. Princess Kate's role during this period was crucial but often overlooked in the immediate coverage. She had been the steady presence holding things together, supporting William while also caring for their children and managing her own grief. Her strength wasn't the kind that drew attention to itself, but rather the quiet resilience of someone doing what needed to be done because there was no alternative. Those who observed her during this time spoke of her grace under pressure and her ability to remain focused on what mattered most, keeping her family intact. The truth about the tragedy, when it finally became clear, had a surprising effect on public opinion. Rather than feeling betrayed by the initial lack of details, most people understood why the family had been cautious about sharing information. The situation was deeply personal, involving matters that anyone would want to keep private. The fact that even the royal family, with all their resources and support systems, could face such difficulties made them more relatable rather than less. It reminded everyone that wealth and status provide no immunity from the kinds of losses and struggles that touch every human life. In the weeks that followed, conversations about the monarchy began to shift. People talked less about tradition and ceremony and more about the human beings behind the titles. There was a growing recognition that the expectations placed on the royal family were perhaps unreasonable, that asking people to live their entire lives in the public eye while maintaining perfect composure at all times was asking too much. The tragedy had opened up a space for more honest discussions about what it meant to be royal in the modern world. The response to the tragedy extended far beyond the crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace. Across the entire United Kingdom, from the largest cities to the smallest villages, people found themselves united in a way that transcended the usual divisions of daily life. It was a moment of collective grief that seemed to reach into every corner of the nation, touching people regardless of their background, beliefs, or previous feelings about the monarchy. In London, the streets near the palace transformed into something resembling a memorial site that stretched for blocks. The initial gathering of a few hundred people had swelled into thousands and then tens of thousands. People arrived throughout the day and night, many travelling from distant parts of the country just to be present. They came carrying flowers, photographs, handwritten, letters and small tokens of remembrance. The pavement became completely covered with these tributes, creating a carpet of colour and sentiment that grew deeper with each passing hour. The atmosphere among the crowds was unlike anything that had been seen at previous royal events. There was no sense of spectacle or celebration, no tourists snapping cheerful photos. Instead, a profound quiet settled over the gathering. Strangers stood shoulder to shoulder, connected by their shared sense of loss. Some people wept openly, while others simply stood in silence, their faces reflecting the shock and sadness that had gripped the nation. Occasionally, someone would start singing a hymn or saying a prayer, and others would join in, their voices blending together in spontaneous expressions of communal mourning. Similar scenes were unfolding in other cities across Britain. In Edinburgh, crowds gathered outside Holyrood Palace, the official residence of the British monarch in Scotland. People brought Scottish thistles and heather to place among the traditional roses and lilies, adding local touches to the tributes. In Cardiff, the sound of Welsh choirs singing traditional songs of mourning echoed through the streets. In Belfast, despite the region's complicated history with the monarchy, many people came together to express their sympathy and respect. The tragedy had created a moment where political differences and historical tensions seemed to matter less than the simple recognition of human suffering. Churches across the country opened their doors, offering spaces for people to sit quietly, light candles, or attend special services of reflection. Long queues formed outside major cathedrals like St. Paul's in London and York Minster in the north. Inside these ancient buildings, people of all ages knelt or sat in the pews, some praying according to their faith traditions, others simply seeking a peaceful space to process their emotions. The clergy spoke about compassion, shared humanity, and the ways that grief can bring communities together. These messages resonated with believers and non-believers alike, because the feelings being expressed were universal rather than sectarian. What was particularly striking about the public response was how it crossed traditional social boundaries. The monarchy had often been viewed as a divisive institution, with strong supporters on one side and vocal critics on the other. But the tragedy seemed to cut through those divisions. People who had previously questioned the relevance of the royal family in modern Britain found themselves genuinely moved by what had happened. The realization that even those living in palaces could experience profound personal loss created a sense of common humanity that transcended political viewpoints. In pubs and cafes, conversations that might normally have centered on sports or politics turned instead to discussions about the royal family and what they must be going through. People shared their own experiences of loss and grief, finding connections between their lives and the situation unfolding at the palace. Parents spoke about their fears for their own children. Those who had lost loved ones reflected on how grief never fully goes away, regardless of how much time passes. The tragedy had opened up space for people to talk about subjects that are often avoided in everyday conversation. Schools faced the challenging task of explaining what had happened to children and young people. Teachers found themselves having unexpected conversations about loss, family, and the ways that public figures are also private individuals with real feelings. Some schools held special assemblies, while others incorporated discussions into their regular lessons. Young people who had grown up seeing Prince William and Princess Kate as modern, relatable figures were particularly affected. For many of them, this was their first encounter with the idea that terrible things can happen to anyone, regardless of their status or position. The elderly, particularly those who remembered previous moments of national mourning, spoke about how this felt both familiar and different. They recalled the death of King George VI, the funeral of Princess Diana, and the passing of Queen Elizabeth II. Each of those moments had brought the nation together in grief, but this situation had its own unique character. It wasn't about the end of a long life or a sudden tragic accident. It was about ongoing suffering within a family that was still very much in the public eye, still actively serving, still trying to navigate their duties while dealing with private pain. As days turned into weeks, the vigil outside Buckingham Palace continued. Volunteers organised themselves to ensure that the site remained respectful and orderly. They distributed candles, collected flowers before they could wilt, and offered support to those who were visibly distressed. Local businesses provided hot drinks and food to those keeping watch through cold nights. It became a community effort, with strangers working together to maintain a space of collective mourning and support. The media coverage evolved as the initial shock gave way to deeper reflection. Newspapers and television programs moved beyond simply reporting the facts to exploring what this moment meant for the future of the monarchy. Royal experts and historians were invited to provide context, discussing how the institution had weathered previous crises and how it might adapt to this new challenge. There was widespread agreement that something fundamental had shifted in the relationship between the royal family and the public. For the first time in living memory, the monarchy had shown vulnerability in a sustained and public way. This wasn't a brief moment of emotion quickly covered over by a return to formal protocol. Instead, the family had allowed the nation to see their suffering, to witness their humanity in all its raw and unpolished reality. Some commentators argued that this could ultimately strengthen the monarchy by making it more relatable and accessible. Others worried that showing such vulnerability might undermine the sense of stability and continuity that had always been central to the institution's appeal. Inside the palace, life continued in a strange limbo. The usual ceremonies and public duties were suspended indefinitely. Staff members came to work but often found themselves with little to do except wait. The building that was normally bustling with activity had become eerily quiet. Occasionally, family members could be glimpsed at windows, but there were no public appearances, no statements beyond the initial announcements. The silence from within the palace walls only heightened the sense of uncertainty about what would come next. Political leaders from around the world sent messages of condolence and support. the British government issued statements expressing solidarity with the royal bounds. Family. Opposition parties set aside their usual criticisms to offer words of sympathy. Foreign heads of state, many of whom had met members of the royal family at official functions, reached out privately to express their concern. The tragedy had become not just a national story, but an international one, with media outlets around the world providing extensive coverage. As time passed, questions about the future became more pressing. How long would the family remain out of public view? When would normal royal duties resume? What would happen to scheduled events and engagements that had been planned months in advance? The palace offered no clear answers to these questions, stating only that decisions would be made in due course based on what the family needed. This lack of a firm timeline added to the sense of uncertainty, but it also reinforced the message that this time, family needs would take precedence over institutional expectations. The Union Jack continued to fly at half-mast. Over Buckingham Palace and other royal residences, a visible symbol of mourning that could be seen from blocks away. At night, the palace was lit with soft, subdued lighting rather than its usual bright illumination. These small but significant details contributed to the atmosphere of a nation in mourning, reminding everyone who passed by that this was a period of grief rather than business as usual. Young people, particularly those who had grown up with social media, used online platforms to express their feelings and connect with others who were experiencing similar emotions. Hashtags related to the royal family trended for weeks, with millions of posts sharing messages of support, personal reflections on loss, and discussions about the role of the monarchy in contemporary Britain. This digital mourning existed alongside the physical gatherings, creating a multi-layered response that engaged people across different generations and communication styles. The tragedy had forced a séance, reckoning with questions that had long simmered beneath the surface of British society. What did the nation want from its royal family? How much privacy should they be afforded? Was it fair to expect them to maintain perfect composure at all times? Could an institution built on centuries of tradition adapt to the more emotionally open expectations of the 21st century? These weren't questions that could be answered quickly or easily, but the tragedy had brought them into sharp focus in a way that demanded serious consideration. As the initial shock began to fade, replaced by a more sustained sense of sadness and uncertainty, one thing became clear. The monarchy would never be quite the same again. The carefully maintained distance between the royal family and the public had been breached, not through scandal or controversy, but through shared human experience. Whether this would ultimately strengthen or weaken the institution remained to be seen, but there was no going back to the way things had been before. The crown had been revealed to rest on human heads, and those heads could bow under the weight of grief just like anyone else's.